On a cold Tuesday morning in April of 1989, a 34-year-old woman named Clara Whitfield walked into the Gillette livestock auction in Campbell County, Wyoming, and did something that no one in that building expected. She bought sheep, not one or two, not a small starter flock that a person might explain away. She bought 250 Columbia ewes heavy in lamb, their wool thick and pale as February snow, their voices filling the corrals with a sound that had not been welcome in Powder River Basin cattle country for the better part of a century. The auctioneer kept his voice professional. He called the numbers and brought the gavel down the way he always did. But when Clara raised her buyer's card for the third consecutive lot of woolly animals, something shifted in that room. The low murmur that had been running along the bleachers stopped. Men who had been leaning on the rail and talking to their neighbors went quiet. Some of them turned to look at her the way you look at a person who has just said something strange at a funeral. Clara Whitfield kept her card in the air. She was not a large woman. She stood 5'6" in her father's old work boots, which were still creased in the exact places his feet had shaped them over 30 years of Wyoming mornings. She wore a canvas barn jacket the color of dried clay, and her dark hair was pulled back under a faded wool cap. She did not look like someone who had lost her mind. She looked like someone who had made a decision so far in advance of this moment that the moment itself was almost quiet to her. A man in the row behind her, a cattleman from Converse County named Roy Fitch, who ran 800 head on leased federal grazing and had never once in his life questioned whether that was the right way to run a ranch, leaned toward the man beside him and said something low. The man beside him snorted. Clara heard it anyway. She had been hearing that sound her whole life. The drive back to the Whitfield place took 2 hours on roads that were still patchy with the winter's last ice. Clara followed the livestock hauler she had hired, watching the trailer sway slightly on the curves, thinking about her father. Earl Whitfield had built the ranch the way men of his generation built things. Slowly. With his hands. He had started with 320 acres his own father left him, and spent the next 4 decades adding to it parcel by parcel, always paying cash, always waiting longer than the other man was willing to wait. By the time Clara was old enough to understand what the land meant, the Whitfield Ranch stretched across 5,800 acres of short grass prairie and broken rimrock country, along the edge of the Powder River drainage. It was not the biggest spread in Campbell County, but Earl Whitfield knew every acre of it the way he knew the lines of his own hands. He died on a December morning in 1988, a Tuesday which seemed wrong to Clara because her father had always said nothing important happens on a Tuesday. He was in the calving shed checking on a heifer that had been restless all night. Wade Calloway found him at 7:30, sitting against the wooden wall of the pen, his gloves still on his coffee thermos beside him, already cold. The coroner said it was his heart. Clara had driven up from Laramie in a snowstorm that swallowed the highway in both directions, and by the time she reached the ranch, the sky had cleared to that particular Wyoming blue that looks like it goes on forever and means nothing at all. She was 33 years old, and she had not lived on the ranch full-time since she left for the University of Wyoming at 18. She had spent 6 years earning a degree in range science, and then 3 more years working toward a doctorate in soil ecology, writing a dissertation on organic matter cycling in semi-arid grasslands that her advisor called the most technically precise work he had seen from a graduate student in a decade. She had been 4 months from finishing when her father's first heart attack, a smaller one in November of 1987, that the doctors called a warning, had pulled her back to Wyoming. She told her advisor she needed a semester. She never went back. What she came back to was a ranch carrying $380,000 in operating debt, held by the First Wyoming Bank in Gillette, a herd of 400 Angus cross cattle that were decent but not exceptional, and a piece of land that had been grazed the same way for 40 years. Continuous grazing. Cattle roaming freely across the whole pasture, eating what they liked, avoiding what they did not. It was how every rancher in the basin ran their operation. It was how Earl had always done it. And by 1988, the land was starting to show the cost of it. The native grasses were thinning. The invasive species were spreading. The soil was compacting. Clara had written her dissertation on exactly this kind of degradation. She had the data. She understood the mechanism. She knew what was coming if nothing changed. She also knew that the ranch could not survive on the current model. The math was not complicated. Beef prices had been soft for 3 years. The operating costs were not going down. The debt service on $380,000 at 9.5% left almost no margin for a bad year. And in Wyoming, there was no such thing as a guaranteed good one. She had laid all of this out in a notebook during the 2 weeks after her father's funeral, sitting at his kitchen table with his ledgers spread around her, a pot of coffee going cold beside her, running the numbers forward 3 years and 5 years and 10 years. Every path through the numbers she could find ended in the same place. The ranch as it existed was not viable. On the 14th day after Earl's funeral, before the grief had gone anywhere useful, Vernon Hargrove drove his truck up the Whitfield driveway. Vernon Hargrove was 58 years old and had been ranching the land directly south of the Whitfield place for his entire adult life. His grandfather had homesteaded the original Diamond H in 1901. His father had expanded it, and Vernon had made it something that people in Campbell County talked about when they talked about successful ranching. He ran 600 head of registered Black Angus. He had won awards. He had served on the board of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association for 11 years. He was the kind of man who did not need to announce that he had arrived somewhere, because the announcement was built into the way he carried himself. He sat at Earl Whitfield's kitchen table and drank the coffee Clara offered him, and said what he had come to say in the tone of a man who was doing a person a favor by not wasting their time. He wanted to buy the Whitfield ranch. He offered $240,000 for the land, and what was running on it, knowing full well that the appraised value was closer to $360,000. He said the price reflected the debt situation and the condition of the grass and the difficulty of running cattle alone as a woman without experienced hands. He said Earl had been a good man, and he was sorry for her loss. Clara looked at Vernon Hargrove across her father's kitchen table for a long moment. Then she said no. Vernon set down his coffee cup. He looked at her the way a man looks at a person who has not understood him correctly. He said he could go to 260. He said the bank was going to be difficult. He said she would find it hard to hire good help, that the men who knew the basin knew who they wanted to work for, and that running this kind of operation alone was a young person's fantasy. Clara said no a second time. Vernon drove back down the driveway in a truck that cost more than most people in the county made in 3 years. Clara watched him go from the front window. Then she went back to her notebook. Wade Calloway was 52 years old and had worked for Earl Whitfield for 21 years. He was the kind of ranch foreman who could look at a calf from 20 yards and tell you the exact hour it had been born. He knew the Whitfield land better than anyone alive except possibly Clara herself, and he had a particular kind of pride in that knowledge that was inseparable from who he was as a man. He had been with Earl through 2 droughts and 1 catastrophic hailstorm, and the year the price of beef dropped so low that Earl had not paid himself a wage for 6 months. Wade had stayed through all of it. He considered himself the continuity of the place. Clara told him in early January what she was thinking. She explained the rotational grazing system she was considering. She talked about the data on soil organic matter and water retention. She mentioned carefully that she had been researching the possibility of introducing a small sheep flock to handle the invasive broadleaf species that were crowding out the native grasses in the east and south pastures. Wade Calloway listened to all of it with his arms crossed and his jaw set, in the specific way it's set, when he was certain the person talking to him was wrong. He told her that he appreciated what she was trying to do. He told her that Earl had been a smart man and had looked into all kinds of ideas over the years. He told her that the basin ran cattle and had always run cattle, and that there were good reasons for that going back farther than either of them had been alive. He did not mention the sheep-cattle wars directly. He did not need to. Every person who had grown up in Wyoming knew what those words meant. In the decade from 1897 to 1909, cattlemen across the western range had driven competing sheepmen off grazing land with rifles and fire. Herds of sheep had been slaughtered by the thousands. Men had been killed. The land had been divided by an informal law written in blood and never formally repealed, only slowly forgotten. In Powder River Basin country, the memory of it lived in the way people said the word sheep, in the slight pause before it, in the flicker of something hard behind the eyes. Wade told Clara that the hands would not stay if she brought sheep onto the property. He told her this as a fact, not a threat. Clara thanked him for his time and spent 3 more weeks with her notebooks. What she found in the 3rd week changed everything. She had been going through the equipment shed, inventorying tools and spare parts, working her way methodically through the space, the way her father had always kept it, everything in its place, and the place never varying. In the corner behind the oldest of the 3 tractors, under a section of wooden flooring that she only noticed because one plank sat slightly higher than the others, she found a metal box. Inside the box was a notebook. Not one of Earl's farm ledgers, which were precise and economic and recorded only what had happened. This notebook was different. It was filled with her father's handwriting, the same deliberate, unhurried script she had known all her life. But the content was unlike anything she had expected from him. It was research. Careful, methodical research, spanning at least 3 years of reading and note-taking. Articles torn from academic journals. Hand-copied passages from range science literature. Notes from phone conversations with extension agents, with university researchers, with ranchers in New Zealand and Australia, and the Texas Hill Country, who had been running mixed-species operations for a decade. Earl Whitfield had been teaching himself about multi-species rotational grazing in private, and he had been doing it for years. He had understood the mechanism the same way Clara understood it from her science training. Cattle were grazers. They wrapped their tongues around tall grasses and pulled. Sheep were browsers. Their split upper lips let them nibble precisely on broadleaf weeds and invasive shrubs on the leafy spurge, and the knapweed that were consuming the Whitfield pastures one growing season at a time. The 2 species did not share internal parasites. A sheep parasite ingested by a cow died in a cow's digestive system, and the reverse was equally true. Together moved as a dense, unified herd through small paddocks and given frequent rotation to fresh ground, they functioned as something the land had not seen in this part of Wyoming since the great bison herds had moved through in the previous century. They acted as a biological restoration engine. Earl had known all of this. He had been building toward acting on it. The last page of the notebook had a single line written in heavier ink than the rest, as though Earl had pressed harder when he wrote it, as though he wanted the words to stay. Ask Clara. She will know why it works. Clara sat on the floor of the equipment shed for a long time with that notebook in her hands. The cold came up through the concrete beneath her. She did not cry. She sat and read every page from the beginning. And then she sat for a while longer in the silence of the shed, listening to the wind move across the roof, thinking about her father, and about the years she had not been here, and about the fact that he had known the answer and had not been able to reach it in time. Then she drove to Gillette and bought 250 pregnant ewes at auction. The morning the livestock hauler pulled into the Whitfield driveway with the sheep was a Thursday, clear and cold, with a sharp wind coming off the high country to the northwest. Clara was in the yard when the truck arrived. Wade Calloway came out of the calving barn where he had been working on a water line and stopped when he saw what was coming down the ramp. He stood there for a moment. Then he pulled the work gloves from his hands slowly, the way a man does when he has already made a decision and is just completing the physical actions that go with it. He said he had been clear about where he stood. Clara said she understood where he stood. Wade said Earl would not have done this. Clara said Earl had planned to. That stopped him for a moment. A look moved across his face that she could not entirely read. Then he put his gloves in his back pocket and walked to his truck. By noon, the 3 other full-time hands had done the same. 2 of them did not say anything to Clara before they left. One of them, a younger man named Curtis, who had been on the place for 8 months, stopped by the barn door and looked at her with something that might have been regret, and said he was sorry. But he had to think about his reputation in the valley. Clara thanked him for his work and wished him well. By 4 in the afternoon, she was alone on 5,800 acres, with 400 cattle and 250 sheep and fencing systems that required at minimum 2 people to move effectively. She drove to the nearest town that evening and pinned a handwritten notice on the board at the feed store. It said she was looking for a general ranch hand, no experience required, room and board, provided wages modest but honest. 3 days later, Seth Briggs showed up at the gate in a truck that was older than he was. Seth was 20 years old, lean and tall in the way of young men who have done physical work, but not yet filled out the full width of their frame. He was from Fort Collins, Colorado, where his family had run a small operation on leased ground, about 1,200 acres of dryland wheat, and a small cow-calf herd, until the spring of 1985, when the combination of 3 straight years of low commodity prices and a balloon payment on a machinery loan had finally broken what the years before had only bent. His father had signed the papers in a bank office in March of 1985, and the family had moved into a rental house in town by June. Seth had finished high school and then spent 4 years working whatever agricultural jobs he could find across Colorado and Wyoming. He was not looking for adventure. He was looking for a place to do the work he knew how to do, which was most of the work that needed to be done on a cattle operation, even if he had never worked with sheep in his life. He said this directly when Clara met him at the gate. He said he could fix fence drive equipment, work cattle, manage water systems, and do whatever else needed doing. He said he did not know anything about sheep, but that he was willing to learn quickly. Clara asked him why he had left his last job. He said the operation he had been working for had sold its grass lease to a corporate feedlot company and converted to a contract finishing yard. He said he had no interest in working for a corporation that thought of animals as inventory. Clara asked him when he could start. He said he had everything he owned in the back of the truck. Seth Briggs moved into the bunkhouse that afternoon and had the first paddock fence system set up by the following morning. What they were building was based on the same principles Clara had studied in graduate school and found documented in her father's secret notebook. The idea was to take a flock of sheep and a herd of cattle and move them together as a single dense group across the pasture in small contained paddocks, staying in each paddock no more than 48 to 72 hours before moving to the next. The high density of animals in a small area did several things simultaneously that continuous grazing could not. The cattle ate the tall grasses they preferred. The sheep consumed the broadleaf weeds the cattle ignored. The concentrated pressure of hundreds of hooves churned the compacted top layer of soil and pressed dead plant matter into the ground, creating the beginning of an organic layer that would hold moisture. The animals fertilized evenly across the paddock, rather than selectively near water sources the way freely ranging cattle did. And because they moved quickly, the grass they left behind had enough leaf surface remaining to photosynthesize and recover fast. The theory was elegant, and Clara had believed it for years. The first 3 weeks of practice were something considerably less than elegant. The first time Seth and Clara pushed the 250 ewes into the south pasture, where the 400 Angus cross cattle were grazing the cattle, did what cattle do when something entirely foreign to their experience moves toward them from an unexpected direction. The 2 lead cows put their heads down, snorted, and went through the temporary polywire fence at a full run. The fence line that had taken Seth 4 hours to set up was lying flat in the grass within 30 seconds. The sheep, startled by the stampede of animals 5 times their size, compressed into a tight, immovable mass in the corner of the paddock and refused to move under any circumstances for the better part of an hour. It took Clara and Seth the rest of that day and half the following one to collect the scattered cattle and repair the fencing. In the evening, sitting on the tailgate of Clara's truck with the last of the daylight going red over the rimrock, Seth said quietly that this might take longer than he had initially estimated. Clara said that she was aware of that. In the second week, the cattle stopped running. They did not welcome the sheep, but they stopped treating them as something requiring immediate departure. The animals began to develop what Clara described to Seth as a working tolerance, the kind of unenthusiastic coexistence that happens between creatures who have realized that the other creature is not going to leave and is not going to eat them, and that the grass in the next paddock is more interesting than the question of species boundaries. By the end of the first month, the cattle and sheep were moving through the paddocks in something that could be called, if you were being generous, a unified herd. Not graceful, not smooth, but together. Meanwhile, in the town of Gillette and in the smaller communities scattered across the basin, the news of what Clara Whitfield was doing on the old Earl Whitfield place had moved with the particular efficiency of rural information networks, which is to say it had moved fast, and it had not improved in the telling. At the Powder River Diner on a Wednesday morning in early May, Vernon Hargrove sat at the round table in the back corner that he had occupied most Wednesday mornings for 15 years. He was with 3 other men whose operations ranched the surrounding country, men who had known Earl Whitfield for decades, and who were watching what his daughter was doing with varying degrees of bewilderment and contempt. One of the men said that he had heard she had 250 head of sheep on the property. Vernon confirmed this. He said it as though he was confirming that someone had suffered a medical event matter of fact, but with an undertone of the serious. Another man said his grandfather's generation had known what to do about sheep in Powder River country. He said it with a short laugh, the way people say things they mean but want to preserve the option of claiming they were joking. Vernon said that the banknote on the Whitfield place came due for review in September. He said this carefully in the tone of a man who is not making a prediction so much as describing a law of nature. He said that a woman running 250 sheep and 400 cattle alone with one hired hand on land that was already showing pasture degradation was going to have a very difficult time demonstrating to Dennis Albright at First Wyoming that she represented a sound investment of the bank's capital. He did not say that he expected to own the Whitfield place before the first snow. He did not need to. The table understood him. What Vernon Hargrove did not know and what Clara Whitfield did not know was what Wade Calloway had been doing in the weeks since he left the Whitfield payroll and moved his tools and his considerable knowledge of the basin to the Diamond H. Wade had called Dennis Albright at First Wyoming Bank twice in the month of April. Clara would not learn this until much later. The calls, as Wade framed them, were the responsible actions of a man who had worked closely with the Whitfield operation for 21 years and felt an obligation to the community and to the financial institution that held the paper on the property. He told Albright that in his professional assessment, Clara Whitfield was not in a condition to make sound operational decisions. He used the word grief several times. He described the purchase of the sheep as an emotional reaction to loss rather than a business strategy. He said the mixing of species on degraded pasture was the kind of thing you read about in university papers that had never been tested against actual Wyoming conditions. He suggested that the bank might want to move its review timeline up rather than waiting until the scheduled date in December. He said that if the bank moved in September rather than December, it would be protecting its collateral before a bad year became an irreversible one. Albright had listened carefully. He had thanked Wade for his call. He had pulled the Whitfield file and scheduled an internal review for August 3 months earlier than planned, which meant that Clara's actual deadline for demonstrating financial viability was September 15th, not December as she believed. Clara did not know this. She was out in the east pasture moving polywire. The Wyoming spring moved towards summer the way it always did, not gently but with a kind of grudging permission, the cold releasing its grip slowly. And then all at once the grass coming in pale green, and then darkening as the soil warmed. Clara and Seth worked from first light to last. There was always more to do than the hours allowed. The water systems needed daily checking. The temporary paddock fences needed moving every 2 days without exception. The ewes began lambing in late April, which meant barn checks through the night for 2 weeks. Seth sleeping in 4-hour stretches on a cot in the barn aisle, Clara doing the same in the chair beside the lambing pen. The physical work was a specific kind of exhaustion that Clara had not felt since her undergraduate years, when she had spent summers working on range research crews. It was the exhaustion that came from using your body all day in the outdoors for a purpose that mattered. And it had a quality to it that she recognized as different from the exhaustion of sitting at a desk, even when that desk held work she cared about. It went into the muscles and the joints and the particular places where strain accumulates, and at the end of the day it allowed a kind of sleep that nothing else produces. She did not have time to think about the community's opinion of her during the working hours. The opinion came to her in town at the feed store, and the co-op and the diner, in the particular silences that fell when she came through a door, and the way those silences filled themselves back in with the murmur of resumed conversation. It came in the form of a man at the co-op counter who asked her how the petting zoo was going, and then turned back to his own business with a small smile before she could answer. It came in the form of a woman at the diner who asked with careful politeness whether Clara had thought about what she was going to do after the bank situation resolved itself. It came in the form of Vernon Hargrove, who pulled up beside her truck in the parking lot of the feed store in late May and said through his open window without getting out that his offer was still open. He said $260,000. He said the sheep were not going to save her, and that everyone who knew the basin understood this. He said Earl Whitfield was a good man who had built something real, and it would be a shame to watch it go to auction. Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she said that the offer was still declined, and that she had feed to load. Vernon drove away. Seth watched this exchange from the feed store loading dock where he was stacking 50-pound bags. When Clara came back to the truck, he did not say anything for a moment. Then he said that the man did not seem like someone who was going to stop. Clara said that she was counting on that. Seth did not ask what she meant. He had been watching Clara Whitfield work for 2 months by that point, and he had developed a reasonable understanding of when a statement was complete and when it was an opening for conversation. This one was complete. By the end of June, something was happening in the east paddocks that Clara had been watching for and hoping for, and not been entirely certain she would see this early. The paddocks that the combined herd had moved through in April and May were different from the paddocks on Vernon Hargrove's side of the fence line. Not dramatically different, not yet, but measurably different to someone who knew what to look for. The soil was darker. The surface crust was breaking up where the animal traffic had worked the compaction loose. In the places where the sheep had concentrated their grazing, the leafy spurge that had been advancing steadily into the east pastures for several years was thinner, its reproductive cycle interrupted by being grazed at the precise moment when it needed its leaf surface most. The native grasses in those paddocks were coming back with a density that Clara had not seen in the east pastures in years. She crouched down in the evening light and pressed her hands flat against the ground. In the first paddock the herd had worked through, the soil held a faint coolness that the surrounding ungrazed ground did not. It had rained less than an inch in June, which was normal for the basin. But the moisture in this paddock was holding in a way the bare, compacted ground of the continuous grazed sections was not. Seth crouched beside her. He was not a man who needed everything explained to him, which Clara had come to consider one of his most valuable qualities. He looked at the ground for a while. Then he said that it looked like something had changed in the dirt. Clara said that the dirt had started remembering how to hold water. Seth looked at the paddock on Vernon's side of the fence, where the grass was pale and even, and slightly tired-looking in the way that overgrazed continuous pasture looks in late June. Then he looked back at the darker ground beneath his hands. He said quietly that the difference was already visible. Clara said that September was still a long way away. She did not say what she was afraid of. She did not say that the bank deadline she was working toward was the one Albright had given her in a letter that spring, the original December date, and that she had not yet spoken to anyone at First Wyoming since then, and that there were things happening in Gillette in certain offices and across certain telephone lines that she had no knowledge of and no way to see. She stood up and brushed the soil from her hands and looked out across the Whitfield land in the late evening light. The sheep were moving quietly across the far paddock, their white shapes catching the last of the sun. The cattle moved among them without urgency. Somewhere to the south, past the fence line that divided the Whitfield range from the Diamond H. Vernon Hargrove's registered Angus, were grazing the same ground they had grazed for years. There were 180 of them, the best of his herd, 3 generations of selective breeding representing the most visible proof of the Hargrove legacy in Campbell County. Vernon had shown them at the state fair. He had sold breeding stock from that herd to operations across 3 states. Those 180 animals were the thing he was most proud of in a life that had given him considerable things to be proud of. In a different kind of summer, this would have been the place where both operations continued on their separate paths, separated by a fence and a philosophy and the long memory of a war that had ended before either Clara or Vernon was born. But this was not going to be a different kind of summer. What was coming for the Powder River Basin was already in the atmosphere, already building in the columns of hot, dry air, rising off the high plains to the south and west, already visible in the long-range forecast that the extension agent had mentioned to Clara in passing on the phone in late June, and which Clara had noted in her notebook, with a careful attention that she did not allow herself to show on her face. The summer of 1989 was going to test everything she had built in these first months, in ways that no notebook and no dissertation and no amount of careful planning could fully anticipate. She looked at the sheep moving in the late light. She thought about her father sitting against the wall of the calving pen, with his gloves still on and his coffee already cold. She thought about the notebook under the floorboards. The years of research he had done alone, the line he had written in heavy ink at the end of it. Then she went inside to start the morning's list. The summer of 1989 came to Powder River Basin the way trouble usually comes to high country. Not all at once, in stages. First, the wind shifted and stage shifted, coming out of the southwest, where the high-pressure ridge had parked itself, and showed no interest in moving. Then the clouds that built up in the afternoons over the Bighorn Mountains to the west stopped producing rain and started producing only the kind of sky that looks like rain but delivers nothing, the kind that teases the thermometer down by 4 degrees and raises your hope and then moves on east without opening. Then the grass on the unfenced hillsides started going the color of old straw before the 1st of July, which was 3 weeks earlier than anyone in the basin could remember seeing it happen. By mid-July, the extension office in Gillette had confirmed what the ranchers already knew from looking out their windows every morning. The summer of 1989 was going to be a drought year, not the ordinary kind of dry that you planned around and absorbed and filed away in your memory as a hard year. This was the other kind, the kind that showed up once in a generation and did not leave until it had taken something permanent. Clara Whitfield watched the sky every morning from the porch of the ranch house with her coffee and her father's notebook open on the railing beside her. She had been tracking the moisture readings in each paddock since May, pressing a simple soil probe into the ground at 6 points per paddock and recording the numbers in columns the way her dissertation research had trained her to do. The numbers told a story that the sky was only beginning to confirm. On her side of the fence, the paddocks that the combined herd had worked through in the spring were holding, not abundantly. The grass had slowed its growth, and some of the shallow-rooted annual species had gone dormant. But the deep-rooted native fescue and the western wheatgrass were still pulling moisture from the subsoil, still green at the base, even when the tips went dry. The organic layer that the hooves and the manure and the decomposing plant matter had been building since April was doing what Clara had spent 6 years studying in a laboratory and 3 years arguing for in a dissertation. It was acting as a sponge. It was holding what little moisture the soil received and releasing it slowly the way good agricultural soil behaves when it has been managed with patience rather than extracted with force. On Vernon Hargrove's side of the fence, the story the ground told was different. Clara could see it from the rise in the east pasture, where she often stood in the evenings to check the paddock fencing. Vernon's grass was going first. The continuous grazing of 600 head across thousands of acres had done what continuous grazing always eventually does. The cattle had eaten the grasses they preferred down to the crown repeatedly, over years and decades, weakening the root systems, reducing the organic return to the soil, compacting the top layer into something closer to a hard pan than a living medium. In a wet year, the damage was invisible because the grass recovered fast enough to stay ahead of the pressure. In a dry year, the damage became the whole story. Vernon's south pastures were pale and thin by the 3rd week of July. His cattle were covering more ground each day to find adequate forage, burning calories in the search, arriving at the water sources thinner than they had been the week before. Seth noticed it too. He had been noticing things about the land with increasing precision over the months he had been on the property, developing the specific literacy that comes from working the same ground daily, reading it the way you eventually learn to read the face of someone you have been paying close attention to for a long time. He stood at the east fence one evening in late July and looked at the 2 pastures side by side without saying anything for a while. Then he said that it looked like someone had drawn a line down the middle of the county and given one half the rain and kept the other half dry. Clara said that no one had drawn any line. She said the line had been building for 40 years on one side of the fence and 18 months on the other. Seth looked at the ground on both sides for a while longer. Then he said that the difference was not subtle anymore. It was not subtle, and Vernon Hargrove had begun to see it. He had driven his truck to the fence line on 3 separate occasions that Clara knew of, stopping at the high point on the county road where you could look down into both properties at once. She had seen his truck there the first time at dawn on a Monday morning, sitting with the engine running, not moving for 20 minutes. She had watched from the equipment shed doorway without going out. She did not know what he was thinking. She suspected he was doing the arithmetic that she had done months earlier, the calculation of what the numbers meant, the one that came out the same way regardless of how many times you ran it. What happened on the night of August 3rd began the way the worst things on a working ranch begin, with silence where there should have been sound. Seth had developed a habit over the previous weeks of walking out to check the main water pump at 11 in the evening before he turned in. It was not a scheduled check. It was the habit of a young man who had spent 4 years watching other people's operations fail from deferred maintenance, and had decided somewhere in that experience that the things you checked when you were tired were the checks that mattered most. He put his boots on and walked out in the dark with a flashlight, and led himself through the gate to the east paddock, where the Honda pump ran continuously, drawing from the deep artesian well that was the primary water source for the upper pastures. He heard the silence from 50 yards away. The pump ran with a specific sound, a steady mechanical heartbeat that you stop noticing after a few days, the way you stop noticing the sound of a refrigerator. When it stopped, the absence of it was louder than the sound had been. Seth increased his pace. When he got close enough for his flashlight to reach the equipment, he stopped walking. The main polyethylene pipe, 3 inches in diameter, the line that carried water from the pump to the distribution trough system, covering the upper 2/3 of the property, had been severed. Not burst, not failed from pressure or frost damage. Cut. The cut was clean on both edges. A single perpendicular slice through the wall of the pipe, the kind of cut that a heavy implement makes when it is swung with intent. The ground around the cut was wet in a wide radius where the water had pumped out freely into the dirt. The pump itself had run dry after the line failed and had over-revved until the connecting rod let go. Seth shone his light on the engine block. The casing had cracked. There was a dark smear of oil and metal on the ground beneath it. He stood there for a moment in the dark with his flashlight on the ruined equipment. Then he turned the beam slowly across the ground near the cut pipe, moving it in a careful arc, the way you search for something you are not sure you will find. He almost missed it. It was lying in the grass about 15 feet from the cut, half covered by the way the grass had sprung back up around it. A pair of bolt cutters, the heavy kind with long handles and hardened jaws, capable of cutting through chain link or steel cable, or the wall of a 3-inch poly pipe. Seth crouched down and looked at them without touching them. The handles had a piece of electrical tape wrapped around the grip of the left handle, for identification, the way working tools get marked when multiple hands are using them on the same property. Under the tape in the metal itself, 2 letters had been stamped. WC. Seth sat back on his heels in the dark. He looked at the letters for a long time. Then he stood up and walked back to the ranch house and knocked on Clara's door. She came to the door in her barn jacket over her sleeping clothes, the way a person comes to the door on a working ranch when someone knocks after 10, because there is always the possibility that the knock is about something that cannot wait. Seth told her what he had found. He told her about the pump and the pipe and the bolt cutters with the stamped initials. He described the cut in the pipe carefully, the angle of it, the cleanness of the edge. He said it twice clearly so there was no ambiguity. Clara listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she asked him to walk her out to where the bolt cutters were. She looked at them for a long time with her flashlight. Then she picked them up by the jaw end, the part that no one had touched, because it was the working end and not the grip. And she carried them back to the ranch house and put them in the metal box under the floorboards where she had found her father's notebook. She did not call the sheriff that night. She did not make any calls at all. Seth was watching her when she came back out. She said they had 700 animals and no water, and the sun was going to be up in 4 hours. The nearest alternative water source was a natural spring deep in the Box Canyon on the northwest edge of the property, 3 miles from the current paddock location, through brush country that was dense and dry and had not been worked by livestock in years. It was not a good option. It was the only option. Clara saddled her horse in the dark. Seth did the same. They called the 2 border collies Rook and June and went out into the dark Wyoming night to move 700 animals through 3 miles of rough country to water. What followed was the hardest physical work Clara Whitfield had done in her life, and she had been doing hard physical work since she was 8 years old. The cattle came off the dry trough, agitated and thirsty, their restlessness translating into the kind of unpredictable movement that makes night work dangerous. The sheep were worse, tightly bunched and unwilling to move forward into ground. They did not know the dogs working furiously around their perimeters, Rook in particular pushing hard into the flanks of the ewe-mob to keep them moving. Clara rode wide on the right side of the combined herd, and Seth rode wide on the left, and they moved through the dark with the flashlights off, because the lights confused the animals more than the darkness did. The brush country pulled at the horses and caught on the livestock, and twice Clara had to dismount and pull a section of old fence wire from the path before the herd could move through. The smoke from distant fires somewhere in the Bighorns had thickened through the night, and the air tasted of it that dry, bitter taste that you do not forget once you have worked in fire country long enough to know what it means. They reached the canyon spring at 10 in the morning, 6 hours of work for 3 miles. The cattle went straight to the water and stood in it. The sheep lined the edges and drank without stopping for a long time. Clara sat on a rock at the edge of the spring pool and looked at the animals and did not say anything. Seth unsaddled his horse and sat down near her. He looked the way she felt, which was the kind of tired that goes past the muscles into something underneath. His hands were wrapped with baling twine where a wire cut on his left palm had reopened during the ride. He had not said anything about the cut. He had not said anything about much for the last 3 hours. He said now quietly that he was not sure how much longer they could run at this pace. He said the truck was running hot. He said the secondary pump that could draw from the canyon spring had a bearing that was going to fail within 2 weeks, and they did not have the money to replace it from stock. He said he was not complaining. He was accounting. Clara looked at the water moving through the rocky channel at the bottom of the canyon. She looked at her own hands, which were cracked at the knuckles from the dry air, and marked with the small, specific injuries that accumulate on working hands over a long summer. She thought about the box under the floorboards and the bolt cutters and the letters stamped in the steel, and what they meant about who had been making decisions that affected her life, from a position she had not known existed. She thought about September 15th, which was 43 days away. She thought about the December deadline she believed she was working toward, and the real deadline that was already bearing down on her that she still did not know about. She thought about her father sitting at his kitchen table alone for 3 years, filling a notebook that nobody knew existed, building toward a decision that he never got to make. Her hands were shaking slightly, and she put them flat on the rock and pressed them down until the shaking stopped. She said to Seth that they were going to make it to September. She said it with less certainty than she usually put into statements, which was the most honest way she could say it. which was the only way she was going to say it. Seth looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded and started working on the saddle cinch that needed adjusting. The canyon held the combined herd for 2 days, while Clara drove to Gillette and spent money she did not have on a section of replacement pipe and a water pump seal kit and 2 canisters of high-temperature bearing grease. She fixed what could be fixed. She rerouted the water supply line around the cut section, using compression fittings that cost more per foot than she wanted to think about. She was back in the canyon by nightfall of the 2nd day, and they began moving the herd back toward the upper pastures in the morning of the 3rd. It was on the drive back from Gillette that she noticed the sky to the south. The thunderheads that built up over Powder River Basin in late summer were a specific kind, tall and flat-bottomed and moving fast when they moved. And Clara had grown up reading them the way her father had taught her to read them, not as weather, but as events that required decisions. The line of storms building to the south over the Hargrove land were the kind she had learned to be careful about. The anvil tops were high and clean against the sky, which meant the cells were powerful. The bottoms were dark, but not the green dark that meant hail. The dark here meant electricity, and the humidity on the ground, which Clara measured out of long habit by the feel of the air on her forearms, was low enough that anything a cloud dropped in precipitation would evaporate before it hit the grass. She had seen this before. Her father had shown it to her once when she was 11. A line of storms moving through dry air, dropping lightning like it cost nothing and delivering rain that turned to vapor before it reached the earth. Dry lightning on overgrazed, drought-stressed grass in August. She drove faster. She reached the ranch as the first lightning was striking the ridgeline to the south. She could see it from the truck. The white-purple flashes against the darkening sky, 3 and 4 at a time. The thunder coming delayed and rolling across the basin floor. The storm was moving northeast, which meant it was moving toward the Hargrove land and then toward hers, and the wind driving it was the kind that comes with a cold front, pushing fast from the southwest, erratic and gusting and capable of carrying embers a 1/4 mile ahead of a fire's leading edge. She and Seth got the herd pushed back into the canyon paddock before the first smoke column appeared. It rose from the ridgeline 2 miles south of the Hargrove main barn, a column that started white and went gray, and then black, as it found the dry grass and the dead woody debris that had been accumulating on that hillside through a summer of no rain and 600 head of cattle that had eaten every piece of green material within reach. The fire did not build slowly. A wind-driven fire on overgrazed ground with a dry lightning ignition point does not give you stages to watch. It goes from a column of smoke to a moving wall in the time it takes you to decide what to do. Clara and Seth stood on the rim of the canyon watching it come. The Diamond H pastures burned the way drought-stressed, continuously grazed land burns, which is with a totality that has nothing in common with a grass fire on healthy range. The cheatgrass and the invasive forb species that had been filling the gaps in Vernon's pastures for years were already cured to a perfect fuel load. They caught and carried the fire horizontally across the flats at a speed that was difficult to believe until you had seen it. The flame front was 10 feet high, where it had fuel to climb and moving at 15 miles an hour with the wind behind it. To the southwest, where the fire had started on the ridge, the black scar was already enormous, spreading in 2 directions. The head of it moving northeast toward Clara's fence line and the right flank of it curving toward Vernon's main structures. Clara could see Vernon's trucks moving through the smoke on the Diamond H. She could see the frantic small shapes of men trying to cut containment lines with tractors on ground that was too hard-packed and too dry to give the blade purchase. She could hear faintly above the wind the sound that she recognized after a moment as cattle moving in panic, the particular low, urgent sound of a large herd in motion without direction. Then Seth said her name and pointed, At the base of the ridge, where the Hargrove land met the fence line dividing the two properties in a natural low area between two sections of the Diamond H that Vernon had always used for his registered herd. During the summer months, 180 black Angus cattle had been driven by the advancing fire into a corner. The terrain trapped them on three sides. The ridgeline behind them, burning the rocky drainage to the east, impassable at a run, the west blocked by a burning section of board fence. The fourth side was Clara's fence. The fire was a quarter mile behind the cattle enclosing. Clara looked at the fence. She looked at the cattle. She looked at the paddock on her side of the fence, which was the east paddock. The first paddock the combined herd had worked through in the spring, the ground that had the deepest organic layer, the most moisture, the best recovery. 18 months of work in that ground. The framework of everything she had been building. If she opened that gate, 180 panicked, registered Angus cattle would come through at a run and go wherever the panic took them, through every temporary fence line in the east paddock system. Across the ground she had been restoring with such patience, compacting and churning and disrupting in minutes what had taken a season and a half to build. If she did not open the gate, those cattle would die inside the next 20 minutes. She looked at the animals. She looked at the paddock on her side. She looked at Seth, who was standing very still and not saying anything because he understood the weight of what was in front of her, and he knew that this was not his decision to make. Clara got off her horse and walked to the gate and opened it. The 180 Angus came through like water through a broken dam. They came at a run, spreading out as soon as they had space, the lead animals driving hard for the far end of the paddock and the animals behind them, filling every direction, knocking down the polywire fence lines as though they did not exist, their hooves driving into the organic soil layer with the concentrated force of panic-driven 1,000-pound animals. The noise of it lasted for 10 minutes. Then the cattle had spread into the upper paddocks and the canyon and the long middle section of the east pasture, and the sound dropped to heavy breathing and the movement of animals who had found space and were trying to understand where they were. Clara stood at the open gate and watched. On the Diamond H side of the fence, the fire reached the spot where the Angus herd had been standing 3 minutes after the last animal came through. The dry grass where they had been held burned clean and fast. The fire hit Clara's fence line and crossed it. And then something happened that Clara had believed in from her data and her research and her father's notebook, but had not been certain she would live to see in the specific way that you can know a thing in theory and not know it in your body until the world confirms it. The fire came onto Clara's land and dropped. Not gradually. It dropped from a 10-foot crown fire to a 2-foot ground fire within the first 50 yards of crossing the fence. The roar of it went quiet in a way that was almost more alarming than the sound had been, because silence from a fire means something unexpected is happening. The wall of flame that had consumed the Diamond H pastures with such complete authority came onto the Whitfield ground and found a different world beneath it. No cheatgrass. The sheep had eaten it to the ground before it could cure to fuel. No leafy spurge. No invasive forb cover to carry the flame upward. No dead woody debris because the hoof traffic and the decomposition cycle had pressed it all into the soil months ago. The grass that remained was rooted deep enough to pull moisture from the subsoil even in August, and the organic layer between the grass crowns held a cool dampness that no amount of August heat had been able to fully extract. The fire could not climb. Without vertical fuel, it could not sustain its momentum. It crept forward as a ground fire, smoking heavily, burning the dead tips of the grass, but failing to ignite the crowns, failing to find the ladder fuel that would let it become again what it had been on the other side of the fence. Clara and Seth met it on foot with the water trailer and 2 Indian pump cans and shovels. And because the fire was moving at walking pace rather than running pace, they could walk up to the leading edge of it and fight it directly. The soil under their boots was soft. It gave under the shovel blade and came up in cool, dark clumps that smothered embers when they were thrown. This was not possible on Vernon's land. On Vernon's land, the dirt was baked to concrete and the shovel blades skipped off it. On Clara's land, the dirt cooperated. They worked south along the fire line for 2 hours, throwing dirt and spraying the advancing edge and moving in the way that people move when they are tired past the point of feeling tired and are operating on something below conscious decision-making. The smoke was thick enough to make their eyes run constantly. Seth had tied a bandana over his nose and mouth. Clara worked without one because she had left hers on the fence post a mile back, and there was no time to go get it. They had pushed the fire back to within 100 yards of the fence line when a truck burst through a section of Clara's boundary fence from the Diamond H side, crushing the wire flat under its tires and sliding to a stop in the dirt. 2 men got out. They were black with smoke and ash from hairline to boot sole, and they moved with the specific heavy urgency of men who have been fighting losing battles for several hours. Vernon Hargrove was one of them. Wade Calloway was the other. Vernon grabbed a shovel from the bed of the truck without looking at Clara. He went directly to the fire line and began throwing dirt. He worked with the efficiency of a man who has been doing physical labor for 40 years. Not fast, but not wasting anything either. Each shovelful going exactly where it needed to go. After a moment, Wade Calloway went to the other side of the line and did the same. Clara watched them for a fraction of a second. Then she went back to work. The 4 of them brought the fire to a stop in the southwest corner of the east paddock, as the last of the afternoon light was going out of the sky. The final embers were out by dark. Clara walked the perimeter of the contained area twice to confirm it, checking for hot spots in the organic layer that could reignite in a night wind, pressing her hand to the ground in the way her father had taught her, and holding it there until she was certain. When she came back to where the others were standing, Vernon Hargrove was looking at the ground on Clara's side of the fence line. He was looking at it the way you look at something that has made you reconsider a position you held for a long time, not with pleasure, but with the specific attention of a man doing honest accounting. He looked down at his boots, which had sunk slightly into the soft soil of Clara's paddock with each step he took. He looked at the unburned grass behind where the fire had crept and died. He looked at the black ruin on his own side of the fence, where the fire had moved with total authority and left nothing standing. He did not say anything for a long time. Wade Calloway was standing 6 feet away and also not saying anything. He was looking at the ground near the cut fence line where the 2 properties met, at the place where you could draw a line with your eye from the burned side to the unburned side, and understand in a way that required no explanation from anyone what the difference between them represented. Clara looked at Wade for a moment. He did not look back at her. He looked at the ground. Vernon finally raised his head. He looked at Clara with an expression she had not seen on his face before in the 20 years she had known him, which was the expression of a man who is being required by the evidence in front of him to understand something he had been arguing against. He looked at the pasture behind her, where somewhere in the growing dark, 180 of his registered Angus cattle were distributed across the Whitfield Range alive because a gate had been opened. He looked at Clara. He said nothing. He put his shovel in the bed of his truck. He got in the cab and sat there for a moment with the door open and the dome light on. Then he closed the door and drove back through the broken fence line toward the Diamond H. Wade stood at the fence line a moment longer. He looked at Clara once briefly, and there was something in it that she could not name exactly. and did not try to. Then he followed Vernon through the gap in the fence, and the dark closed in behind them. Seth came to stand beside Clara. He was looking at the unburned grass behind them. He said that he had not been completely certain it would work. Clara said that she had not been completely certain either. Seth looked at the dark shape of the Diamond H land beyond the fence, the smell of the burned ground coming to them on the evening wind. He said that those cattle were still on their property. Clara said that she knew. He said that the East Paddock system was destroyed. Every temporary fence line was down. The organic layer had been subjected to the most intensive hoof pressure it had experienced since the project began. Clara said that she knew that too. Seth was quiet for a moment. Then he said slowly, as though he was working something out while he spoke, that the animal impact from 180 panicked cattle was not necessarily the same thing as destruction of the system. He said that in terms of raw soil disturbance, what had just happened might actually have done in one afternoon what 3 more months of rotational grazing would have done more slowly. He said it uncertainly, framing it as a question rather than a statement. Clara looked at the dark ground under their feet. She had been thinking the same thing since she watched the Angus pour through the gate. The catastrophe had another face, and she had been trying to see it clearly through the smoke and the exhaustion. The organic layer was not gone. It had been compressed and disturbed, but the material was still there. An animal disturbance at high intensity in a short period was a different kind of disturbance than the grinding pressure of continuous overgrazing. The trampling had been violent, but it had been brief. The roots were intact. The moisture was still in the subsoil. She said to Seth that they would know more in 2 weeks. She said that right now they needed to check the canyon spring and make sure the herd had water for the night. They walked back to the horses in the dark, moving through the smell of smoke and the particular silence that settles over a piece of land. After fire has moved through part of it, a silence that is not the same as the ordinary silence of night, that has in it a quality of the aftermath that you can feel in the air itself. Above them, the sky had cleared, and the stars over Wyoming were the kind of stars you only see from open country. Dense and close-looking, the Milky Way across the middle of it, like something permanent, like something that does not care at all about the things that have happened on the ground beneath it. Clara rode toward the canyon without looking back at the burned section of the Diamond H. She thought about 43 days. She thought about $380,000. She thought about Vernon Hargrove's face at the fence line, and about what a man does when the thing he has been certain of for 58 years turns out to require revision. She thought about 180 registered Black Angus cattle loose on her property, and what they represented, and what in the particular way that desperate situations sometimes reveal, unexpected geometry they might yet become. She did not allow herself to think too far ahead. September 15th was still a wall between her and every thought beyond it. But for the first time since spring, the wall felt like something other than a terminus. It felt in a way she was not ready to name, like a door that someone had not yet decided whether to open. The first week of September arrived with a cold that had no right to be there yet. A sharp-edged morning cold that came down off the bighorns before the calendar gave it permission, and settled into the basin floor like it intended to stay. Clara felt it when she stepped off the porch at 5 in the morning, the way the air bit at the back of her hands and made her breath visible in the beam of her headlamp. She stood for a moment looking out across the Whitfield Range in the dark, listening to the particular quiet of a ranch. Before the day starts the low movement of animals in the far paddock, the creak of the equipment shed door in the wind, the sound of the land itself, which is not silence but something more complex than silence. if you have been listening to it long enough to know the difference. 14 days had passed since the fire. What had happened to the East Paddock system in those 14 days was not what Clara had predicted, and not what Seth had tentatively suggested on the night of the fire, when he said that the impact of 180 panicked cattle might have accelerated the system rather than destroyed it. What had happened was more complicated than either prediction and more interesting than both. The intensive disturbance of the panicked Angus herd had compressed the organic layer in ways that varied by location across the paddock. In the areas of highest traffic closest to the gate where the cattle had entered at a run, the surface was churned and rough, and looked for the first several days like something that had been driven over repeatedly with heavy equipment. Clara had walked it every morning with her soil probe recording the numbers, not allowing herself to interpret them until she had at least 10 days of data. On the 10th day, she sat at the kitchen table with all 10 days of readings spread out in front of her and looked at them for a long time. The moisture readings in the disturbed areas were not lower than the pre-fire readings. In 2 zones, they were higher. The churning of the surface had broken the slight crust that had formed during the August heat and had increased the infiltration rate. The organic material that had been pressed into the upper soil layer by the hooves was not gone. It had been incorporated more deeply. The roots of the fescue and the wheatgrass were intact across more than 80% of the disturbed area. The plants were already sending up new growth from the crowns, pale and tentative, but present. Seth had seen it too. He had not said anything about it directly, but she had caught him crouching in the disturbed area on 3 separate mornings, pressing his fingers into the soil and staying there for a while with his head down. He had the habit of thinking through his hands now the way people who work with the land long enough eventually do the way her father had done it, crouching and pressing and going quiet, while the information came through the palms rather than through the eyes. On the 11th day, he came to find her in the barn and said that the grass in the northeast corner of the disturbed area was already showing more recovery than the equivalent paddock on the same recovery timeline from the spring rotation. He said it carefully, as a question in the form of a statement, leaving room for her to correct him. She looked at the numbers in her notebook and said that he was right. He stood there for a moment, absorbing that. Then he went back to fixing the secondary pump bearing without saying anything further. Vernon Hargrove had sent 2 men to retrieve his Angus cattle on the 3rd day after the fire. Clara had opened the gates for them and stayed out of the way while they worked. The cattle were in reasonable condition. They had grazed on Whitfield grass for 2 days and drunk from the canyon spring, and the worst of the panic had left them. Vernon's men sorted them and moved them south without significant difficulty and without speaking to Clara beyond what was necessary to coordinate the gate openings. She watched them load the last of the animals and close their trailers and drive south on the county road. And then she stood at the gate for a while and looked at the Diamond H land beyond the fence. The burned sections of the Hargrove pastures were black and stark. The fire had moved through roughly 40% of the Diamond H grazing ground before the wind had shifted, and the humidity had come up enough overnight to slow the spread to something the county fire crew could eventually contain. The Hargrove main barn and the outbuildings were intact. The registered herd was intact. But the grass that Vernon had been depending on to carry his cattle through the fall was gone across a wide swath of his best grazing country. And the grass that had not burned was in the condition it had been in before the fire, which was not a condition that would support his herd numbers through a Wyoming winter without heavy purchase supplement. Clara knew what that math looked like. She had run similar numbers many times in the past 18 months. What she did not know still was the math that Dennis Albright at First Wyoming Bank had been running since April. She did not know about Wade Calloway's 2 phone calls. She did not know that the December deadline had been moved to September. She did not know that when she drove to Gillette on September 15th, She was not going to make the case for a favorable review at the end of a full operating year. She was going to walk into a room where the decision had been substantially shaped by information she had never been given a chance to contest. She found out on September 8th. The letter from the bank arrived in the afternoon mail, which Seth brought up from the box at the county road with the feed receipts and a machinery parts catalog, and a notice about the upcoming Campbell County livestock auction. Clara opened the letter last because she recognized the first Wyoming letterhead and had developed the habit over the preceding months of giving herself a moment before she opened things that were likely to require a response. The letter was from Dennis Albright. It was polite in the precise way that formal notices from financial institutions are polite, which is to say that it was courteous in its language and devastating in its content. It referenced a loan review scheduled for September 15th, which Clara had not known was September 15th. It referenced concerns about the operational viability of the Whitfield Ranch under current management. It referenced an assessment of risk that cited in language that was careful but specific the significant deviation from conventional ranching practice and the departure of experienced management personnel from the operation. Clara read it twice. Then she put it on the table and sat with it for a while. She thought about the phrase experienced management personnel and about who at First Wyoming would have had reason to use those words and what context would have produced them. She thought about Wade Calloway. She thought about the bolt cutters in the metal box under the floorboard. She thought about the letters stamped in the steel, and about the two edges of the cut pipe, and about the way the pump had run dry and over-revved until the connecting rod failed. She went to the floor in the back room and lifted the plank and took the bolt cutters out of the box. She set them on the kitchen table next to the bank letter and looked at both of them for a long time. Then she got out her own notebook, the one she had been keeping since April, with the soil readings and the paddock rotation records, and the livestock weights and the pasture recovery measurements. And she set that on the table too. She looked at the three things on the table. She picked up the phone and called the First Wyoming Bank and asked to confirm the review appointment for September 15th at 10 in the morning. The receptionist confirmed it. Clara thanked her and hung up. She called no one else that night. The morning of September 15th, she put on her father's old canvas jacket over a clean shirt and drove to Gillette in the dark, arriving early enough to sit in the truck in the bank parking lot for 20 minutes before the building opened. She had the notebook on the seat beside her and the bolt cutters on the floor behind the seat wrapped in a canvas tarp, and she sat in the truck in the empty parking lot with the engine off and the Wyoming sky going from black to gray to the particular cold, pale blue of an early September morning in the high country. She was thinking about her father. She thought about him most mornings, but this morning she thought about him specifically, about the way he had moved through difficulty, which was without announcing it, without making a production of the weight he was carrying. Earl Whitfield had been a man who did not speak much about what things cost him. He registered the cost internally, absorbed it, and then continued in the direction he had decided on. Clara had spent her childhood watching this and had understood from an early age that it was not stubbornness and it was not the absence of feeling. It was a specific and disciplined form of commitment to the work in front of you. She picked up the notebook from the seat and got out of the truck. She went around to the back and took the bolt cutters out from under the canvas tarp and carried both into the First Wyoming Bank of Gillette, Wyoming, at 5 minutes before 10 on the morning of September 15th, 1989. The conference room was on the second floor. Dennis Albright was already there when Clara arrived, along with two other men she recognized as members of the bank's commercial lending board. Albright was in his mid-50s, a careful man who had worked in agricultural lending for his entire career, and who had, in Clara's assessment based on their limited previous interactions, the quality of genuinely not enjoying delivering bad news, even when the news was coming regardless. He greeted her by name and gestured to the chair across the table from the board. Clara sat down. She set the notebook on the table in front of her. She set the bolt cutters on the table beside the notebook. The three men on the other side of the table looked at the bolt cutters. Albright looked at Clara. She said she wanted to cover one matter before they discussed the loan review. She said she wanted to discuss the basis for the review being scheduled for September, rather than December, which was the date she had been given in her original loan modification documentation. She said she was interested in understanding what specific operational information had been provided to the bank between April and August that had produced a change in the review timeline. Albright looked at her for a moment. He looked at the bolt cutters on the table. Clara said that she had a recording of her soil moisture data from every paddock on the Whitfield Ranch taken every third day since April, which she was prepared to walk through in detail. She said she had livestock weight records showing average gains across both the sheep flock and the cattle herd through the summer. She said she had a written assessment from the Range Science Department at the University of Wyoming, which she had requested in July and received in August, evaluating the Whitfield rotational system against published standards for semi-arid rangeland management. She set each of these items on the table as she named them, taking them from the notebook in sequence. Then she said that she also had in her possession a piece of equipment that had been used on the night of August 3rd to sever the primary water supply line on the Whitfield Ranch, causing the destruction of the main water pump, which had resulted in a crisis that had required her to move 700 animals 3 miles through rough country in the dark. She said the equipment bore identifying marks that she would be prepared to provide to the Campbell County Sheriff's Office, and that the nature of the incident, when fully documented, bore directly on the question of whether the information provided to this bank about the Whitfield Ranch's operational stability had been offered in good faith. She did not say Wade Calloway's name. She did not need to. She could see in Albright's expression that the territory she was describing was not entirely unfamiliar to him, and that he understood the direction she was moving. The room was quiet for a moment. Then the door opened. Vernon Hargrove came into the conference room without knocking. He was in his good Western suit, the charcoal gray one that Clara had seen him wear to the Stock Growers Association meetings, and he was carrying a leather portfolio that he set on the table without preamble. Behind him came Wade Calloway, who was not in a suit and who did not look like a man who wanted to be where he was. The silver-haired board member to Albright's left started to say something about the meeting being closed. Vernon looked at him with the specific expression of a man who has been depositing money in this institution for 30 years and is aware that this fact is relevant to every conversation that happens within its walls. The board member did not finish his sentence. Vernon sat down at the end of the table. Wade remained standing near the door. Vernon opened the leather portfolio. He set 2 documents on the table and pushed them toward Albright. The first was a written statement, notarized, which Albright unfolded and began reading. The second was a commercial lease agreement, which Albright set aside for the moment while he read the first. The statement was Vernon Hargrove's account of a conversation he had conducted with Wade Calloway 4 days after the fire, on the evening of August 9th, at the Diamond H kitchen table. Vernon had asked Wade directly whether he had been in contact with anyone at First Wyoming Bank regarding Clara Whitfield or the Whitfield Ranch operation. Wade had said no. Vernon had asked him a second time differently, and Wade had said no again. Vernon had then placed a phone call to a contact he had at the bank. Not Albright, but someone else, and had established that 2 calls had been made to the commercial lending department in April, from a number that Vernon had recognized as the landline at Wade's residence in Gillette. Vernon had gone back to Wade. This time he had not asked a question. What followed in the statement was Wade Calloway's account given to Vernon in his own kitchen, of what he had said to the bank and why he had said it. The statement did not include the bolt cutters or the cut water line. That part Clara had arrived at independently. Albright read the statement to its end. He set it down with the particular care of a man handling something that has consequences he is still calculating. Clara looked at Wade Calloway standing by the door. He had not looked at her since he came in. He was looking at the floor to the left of the table with the expression of a man who has been required to stand in a room and be the subject of documents that describe his actions accurately, which is one of the more uncomfortable positions a person can occupy. Clara looked at Vernon. Vernon was looking at Albright. He said that the review timeline had been altered, based in part on information that had been provided by a party with a financial interest in the outcome of the review, and that this was a matter the bank would need to address in its own way, but that it bore on the legitimacy of conducting any adverse action against the Whitfield loan under the current circumstances. He then pulled the second document, the commercial lease agreement, closer to Albright and said that he was prepared to discuss the contents. The lease was for grazing rights on the Whitfield ranch. Vernon proposed to pay Clara for the right to run 200 of his remaining registered Angus cattle on Whitfield grass under the Whitfield rotational system for 18 months, while the Diamond H pastures recovered from the fire. The payment was set at a rate that was substantially above the going market rate for grazing leases in Campbell County. Clara had not seen the number before this moment. She looked at it. She looked at it again. The number applied against the outstanding loan balance and the accumulated interest covered the September payment and left operating capital for the winter. Albright picked up the lease and read it. He looked at Vernon. He said the rate was higher than he would have expected. Vernon said he was paying for something that was worth more than the standard rate, which was grass, that would still be there in July of next year, and that he expected to receive fair value for what he paid. Albright looked at Clara. Clara had not said anything since Vernon came in. She had been watching and listening and thinking with the part of her mind that ran very quietly and very fast in situations that required it. She had thought about what Vernon's offer meant for the ranch, and what it meant for her, and what it meant that the man sitting across from her had come here this morning with documents and a certified check, rather than an offer to buy the property at below market value. She thought about what had changed for Vernon Hargrove between January and September, and what a man like him who had spent his life at the top of the local hierarchy of land and money and reputation would have needed to see before he would do what he was doing now. She thought he had needed to see the fire stop. She thought he had needed to stand on soft ground and look back at hard ground and feel the difference through the soles of his boots at a moment when the difference was not abstract and not theoretical, but made of fire and smoke, and the specific terror of watching animals you had spent 3 generations breeding walk toward a wall of flame. She thought he had needed in the end to be the kind of man who could revise a position when the evidence required revision, even when the revision was expensive and public, and nothing like the outcome he had intended when he drove up her driveway in January with his offer and his certainty. She looked at Dennis Albright and said that she was prepared to endorse the lease payment to the bank against the outstanding balance and to proceed with the September review on the basis of the operational documentation she had laid out, which she believed would support a continuation of the existing loan under standard terms. Albright looked at the documents in front of him for a moment. Then he said that the bank would need to conduct an internal review of the circumstances surrounding the timeline change, and that pending that review, the September 15th adverse action would be suspended. He said it in the careful, measured language of institutional communication, which is the language of things that have already been decided being made official. Clara picked up the bolt cutters from the table. She said she would be leaving these with the bank's legal department on her way out, along with a written account of the events of August 3rd for their records, and for any other use they determined appropriate. She stood up. She picked up her notebook. She looked at Vernon Hargrove, who was looking at her with the expression she had seen on his face at the fence line after the fire, the expression of a man doing honest accounting on a balance sheet that had not come out the way he expected. She said there was one condition on the lease. Vernon waited. She said that for the first 90 days of the lease, Vernon Hargrove would personally participate in the paddock moves, not observe, not supervise. He would come to the Whitfield Ranch 4 mornings per week and move temporary fence with Seth, with his own hands. She said that you could not understand what the land was doing if you were not standing on it, and that she was not going to be responsible for the welfare of his cattle on her land if he did not understand the system well enough to participate in it. The room was very quiet. Vernon looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his face that was not capitulation and not anger. It was closer to the expression of a man who has encountered a requirement that is unreasonable and also entirely correct, and who is old enough and honest enough to know the difference between those two things and the way they sometimes arrive together. He said, "All right." He stood up and picked up his portfolio. He said his cattle would be at her south gate by 7 the following morning. He walked out of the conference room. Wade Calloway followed him without looking up. The door closed. Clara stood at the table in the silence of the First Wyoming Bank conference room in Gillette, Wyoming, with her father's notebook under her arm. And she allowed herself 30 seconds to feel the full weight of what had just happened. Not triumph. It did not feel like triumph. It felt like something quieter and more durable than triumph. It felt like the ground after rain when the soil has absorbed what it needed, and the surface is settled and you can walk on it without slipping. Then she picked up her things and walked out. The rain came in the 3rd week of October. It arrived the way good rain in the high country sometimes arrives after a long absence, without ceremony, without the drama of the storms that had delivered only lightning in August. It came in from the northwest, on a low gray front that moved slowly, and stayed low and dropped a steady soaking drizzle that lasted for 4 days without interruption. Clara stood on the porch on the first morning of it and held her hand out from under the roof edge and felt the drops on her palm, and did not say anything for a while. Seth came out with 2 cups of coffee and stood beside her. He handed her one. They stood and listened to the rain on the tin roof of the equipment shed, and on the dry grass of the paddocks, and on the surface of the earth that had been waiting for it since March. Seth said that he had never been so glad to hear a sound in his life. Clara said that her father used to say that rain on a tin roof was the most honest sound in agriculture, because it meant something real was happening, and it was not waiting for anyone's opinion of it. Seth was quiet for a moment, watching the rain. He said that he had been thinking about something. He said that he had been thinking about going back to school, not to Fort Collins. There was an agricultural college program through the University of Wyoming Extension System that offered a range management certification, and the coursework could be done through a combination of correspondence and 2-week intensive sessions in Laramie, which would mean he could stay on the ranch and work through it. He said he was not asking for anything. He was telling her because it seemed like the kind of thing she should know about what he was planning. Clara said that the ranch would adjust its schedule around the 2-week sessions without difficulty. Seth said he appreciated that. They stood and watched the rain for a while longer. Somewhere in the east paddocks, the combined herd was standing in the rain, the way cattle and sheep stand in the rain. Heads slightly down, untroubled, their coats darkening with the moisture. The black shapes of them were visible in the gray morning light, moving slowly through the paddock that had been churned and churned again by the fire cattle and the panic of August. and was now under the steady fall of October rain, taking in every drop without losing a single one to runoff. On the Diamond H side of the fence, the rain was hitting the burned sections of Vernon's pasture and sheeting off the hardpan and running into the gullies in thin brown streams. The recovery on the burned land would be slow. The invasive species would come first, the way they always came first on disturbed ground, and they would need to be managed before the native grasses could reestablish. Vernon knew this now in a way he had not known it in January, not because Clara had told him, but because he had spent 6 weeks moving temporary fence 4 mornings per week, and standing on the ground with his hands on the wire and his boots in the soil and the land, had told him itself in the way that land tells things to people who are paying attention. He had not been graceful about it in the beginning. He had been punctual, arriving at the south gate at 7 on the mornings he was expected. But he had worked in the specific silence of a man performing a task he considered beneath him. Seth had shown him the system without commentary and without visible satisfaction in the situation, which was the correct approach and which Vernon had responded to by gradually replacing the silence of resentment with the silence of someone learning something. By the 4th week, he had begun asking questions. Not many. Specific ones, technical ones about paddock sizing relative to herd weight and about the timing of moves relative to grass height. Seth had answered them directly and without elaboration. By the 6th week, Vernon was arriving at 6:45. Clara had watched this from a careful distance. She had been present at the property every morning but had not joined the fence-moving sessions. This had been deliberate. Vernon needed to learn the system on its own terms, not in the presence of the person whose judgment he had been disputing for 9 months. Seth was the right teacher for this because Seth had no history with Vernon, and no score to settle and no investment in being seen to be correct about anything. He was just a 20-year-old from Fort Collins who had learned something by doing it and was showing someone else how to do it the same way. On the 41st morning, as Clara was coming out of the barn, she saw Vernon standing alone in the east paddock after the morning move was done. Seth had gone back to the equipment shed to work on the tractor hydraulics. Vernon was standing in the middle of the paddock that had been the site of the worst of the August disturbance, the zone closest to the gate where the Angus had come through. In panic, the zone that Clara's daily readings showed was now ahead of where she had expected it to be at this point in the recovery cycle. Vernon was standing with his hands at his sides, not doing anything, just standing on the ground in the rain-softened morning air. He was looking at the grass. Then he crouched down slowly, with the deliberateness of a man whose knees have been doing hard work for decades, and he pressed both his palms flat against the earth and held them there. Clara stopped walking. She watched him from 30 yards away. He did not know she was there. He stayed like that for a long time, a full minute, maybe more. His hands flat on the ground, his head slightly bowed, not moving. Then he stood up and brushed the soil from his palms and walked back toward the south gate without looking around. Clara went into the barn and stood in the cool dark of it for a while, with the smell of hay and animals around her, and said nothing to anyone. 2 years later, in the spring of 1991, the University of Wyoming Range Management Extension Program published a technical bulletin. It was written by a range science professor in Laramie who had first heard about the Whitfield Ranch from a graduate student who had driven out to Campbell County in the summer of 1990 to collect soil samples for a study on organic matter recovery in semi-arid rangeland after fire disturbance. The graduate student had arrived expecting to find a straightforward post-fire recovery site and had instead found something that required several phone calls to his advisor before he felt he had language to describe it accurately. The bulletin was 12 pages long and was primarily technical in nature, written for an audience of range managers and agricultural extension agents and the researchers who served them. It documented the soil moisture retention data from the Whitfield paddock system over a full operating year, the livestock performance metrics, the pasture recovery rates following fire disturbance, and the suppression of invasive species in areas under multi-species rotational management. It compared these outcomes against standard continuous grazing benchmarks from comparable Wyoming operations. The comparison was not subtle. The bulletin used the phrase, the Whitfield method, 3 times. Clara read it at the kitchen table on a March morning with coffee and did not say much about it to anyone. She put it in the drawer where she kept the important papers and went out to check the paddock water lines because March in Wyoming means frozen fittings. And frozen fittings mean the day starts with a problem that cannot wait. Seth got his range management certification in the fall of 1991. He came back from the 2-week intensive session in Laramie with a folder of coursework and the certification document and a conversation he had apparently had with the professor who had written the bulletin, who had said that if Seth was interested in continuing his education, there were research assistantship opportunities attached to a follow-on study of multi-species systems in Wyoming and Montana. Seth told Clara about this in the straightforward way he told her about most things factually and without decoration. He said he had told the professor that he would think about it, but that he had obligations at the ranch that he took seriously. Clara said that obligations at the ranch were not going to get in the way of anything Seth needed to do for himself. Seth said he was aware of that. He said he thought he would stay. Clara said, all right. He put his certification document in the bunkhouse and came out the next morning at 5 and started on the paddock move. In the early spring of 1992, on a Thursday morning in March, when the ground was still frozen in the shaded areas but the south-facing slopes were beginning to soften, Clara heard a truck coming up the county road and stopping at the gate. She looked out the kitchen window and saw a pickup she recognized. It sat at the gate for longer than it should have, the engine running. Then the door opened and a man got out. Wade Calloway walked to the gate and stood at it. He was not as large as Clara remembered him, which was not a physical change, but the effect of what the last 3 years had done to his particular kind of self-certainty. He had his hat in his hands. He looked at the ranch house for a moment. Then he looked away at the east paddocks where the first pale green of early recovery was showing in the grass. Seth came out of the equipment shed and saw him. He walked over to the gate without hurrying. Wade said something that Clara could not hear from the window. He said it without looking at Seth directly, looking instead at the paddock behind him. Seth listened. He said something back. Wade nodded once. Seth opened the gate. Clara watched Wade Calloway walk through the gate onto Whitfield land for the first time in 3 years. She watched Seth lead him out toward the east paddock where the morning move needed doing. She stood at the window for a moment. She could see the two of them standing at the fence line, Seth showing something, Wade looking at the ground. Seth crouching and pressing a hand to the earth. Wade watching. Then Wade crouched too slowly, his old knees taking their time about it, and pressed his own hand to the ground. Clara turned away from the window. She picked up her coffee. She picked up her father's notebook from the table where it always sat. Now the cover worn and the binding repaired twice with electrical tape, the pages soft from years of handling. She had read it so many times that she knew which pages would fall open naturally and which ones required you to hold them in place. She knew where her father's handwriting changed when he was tired and where it steadied when he was working through something that interested him. She knew the pages where he had pressed harder with the pen, where the ideas were coming faster than the hand could follow. She knew the last page. She did not need to open to it. She had the line memorized in the specific way you memorize things that matter, not by trying, but by repetition, and wait the words settling into you until they are no longer separate from the thoughts you think in your own voice. Ask Clara. She will know why it works. She set the notebook down on the table. She looked out the window at the east paddocks where the pale green was coming up through the still pale grass of early Wyoming spring, where the ground under it was dark and soft and held its moisture. The way ground holds moisture when it has been given the time and the management and the particular combination of animal and soil and season to remember how. She put on her jacket and her father's boots and walked outside to start the morning. The gate at the south end of the east paddock was open. Through it she could see Seth and Wade working the fence line together, moving the temporary wire from the paddock that was done to the fresh paddock that was ready, the way you moved it every 2 days, without exception. The rhythm of it steady and unpretentious, the most basic possible form of the work. She stood and watched them for a moment. The Wyoming morning was cold and clear and going blue, the way Wyoming mornings go blue in early spring when the air is still and the mountains to the west are white and the sky above them is the color of something that has been there since before anyone who ever worked this ground was born, and will be there long after the last fence wire has rusted back into the earth. Clara walked out to where they were working and picked up the other end of the fence wire.